Okay, welcome everybody. As we give folks another couple minutes to get into the webinar, we'll just start with introductions for today. So welcome all, happy to see folks here. My name is Jessica Rudnick. I am a California Sea Grant Extension Specialist based in the Delta and partnered with the Delta Stewardship Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone in today for our second of a 4-part environmental justice brown bag series focused on diving more in depth on environmental and social justice issues relevant to the California Delta. And the environmental justice brown bag series was designed to bring more attention and research, relevant research into growing conversations around the social and human elements of the Delta, particularly with a focus on environmental and social justice. And for those unfamiliar with the Delta Stewardship Council, the Stewardship Council is a California state agency tasked with achieving the state's co-equal goals for the Delta, which include building a more reliable statewide water supply and protecting the Delta's ecosystems, all in a manner that value the people living, working, and recreating in the Delta. And the council is beginning to work on integrating more environmental justice principles into the agency's operations. And so this brown bag series is aimed at inspiring conversations and bringing more ideas from leaders, advocate scholars, and public policy leaders who have been working on environmental justice and very influential in this field, the activism and scholarship, bringing those ideas into this work that we're starting at the Stewardship Council. We had our first talk of the series in September, which was focused on water justice and the human right to water, given by Laurel Firestone, a member of the State Water Resources Control Board, and Dr. Kristen Dobbin, a postdoctoral scholar at UCLA. And the recording for that seminar is available for anybody on the council's website. And then after today's talk, we have an additional 2 seminars planned, one in November and one in December. The details for those talks are featured here, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for the full series, and hopefully all of the series will be recorded and available for follow-up watching if you're unable to make it. So just a few housekeeping logistics today before we turn it over to the speaker. There is a chat function and a Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you should be able to submit your questions for Dr. Harrison. We'll be waiting to hold all questions until the Q&A at the end of the seminar. And just so everyone knows, the chat is available to be seen by all attendees, and we expect that the chat and Q&A will be used respectfully and on topic for the talk today. So with that, thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. We're really excited to hear from our speaker today, and I'll hand it over to Karen Gutierrez to introduce our speaker, Dr. Harrison.
Okay, thank you, Jess. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Gutierrez, and I am the 2021 California Sea Grant Fellow for Science Communication at the Delta Science Program. And just happy Wednesday. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'll be giving a brief introduction to Dr. Harrison's work and what brings her here today. So Dr. Jo Lindsay Harrison is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research focuses on environmental sociology, sociology of agriculture and food systems, environmental justice, and political theories of justice with a regional emphasis in the United States. Her research covers political conflict over agricultural pesticide poisonings in California, recent escalations in immigration enforcement in rural Wisconsin, and government agencies' environmental justice efforts, with the thread throughout being an aim to help identify and explain the persistence of environmental inequalities and workplace inequalities in the United States today. So she has written 2 books, the first being Pesticide Drift and the Pursuit of Environmental Justice in 2011, and the second being From the Inside Out, the Fight for Environmental Justice Within Government Agencies, published in 2019, which is her talk focus today. So without further ado, I hand it over to Dr. Harrison.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. And thanks to all of you for the invitation to share my research with you today. I'm just going to share my slides here. And also thanks to all of you who are taking your lunchtime to join us and to tune in and learn about this. I appreciate your interest in the topic and the commitment of the Delta Stewardship Council to engaging more meaningfully with environmental justice. So I first just want to briefly acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the University of Colorado Boulder, and that CU Boulder sits on land within the territories of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. And I further acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to lands that make up the state of Colorado. So one of the things that I do in my work and that I look forward to doing more, and one of the things that we can talk about in the Q&A, is ways to integrate that kind of recognition into government agency practice in the pursuit of environmental justice, broadly defined. So, and I'll go through and I'll talk about some of the ways that we can define environmental justice and understand that as it relates to environmental regulatory practice. All right, so I've been researching environmental regulation and environmental regulatory practice for about 20 years, and specifically, a lot of that work specifically, and most of it is really focused on environmental justice or environmental injustice, which is a phrase that comes from the environmental justice movement. So this loosely networked constellation of grassroots activists across the United States and beyond who have really pressed for remedies and justice for the fact that racially marginalized, working class, and indigenous communities are disproportionately burdened by environmental harms. And that disproportionate burden comes in multiple overlapping forms. It includes disproportionate exposures to environmental hazards, a greater degree of vulnerability to problems from exposure to those hazards, and also disproportionately less access to environmental amenities like parks and green spaces that are so important for quality of life. Now, hundreds of studies have demonstrated these environmental inequalities. They contribute to vast inequalities in illness and death, and therefore absolutely need our attention. They stem from a long history of many different factors that come together to produce these outcomes. And they persist despite government agencies' commitments to and accomplishments in terms of environmental protection. Now, the politics of environmental justice and environmental injustice have arguably become more public than ever in the past 2 years, due to various factors, including recent reports documenting that the COVID-19 pandemic is disproportionately killing Native American people and people of color in this country. And that outcome itself stems from a lot of different factors, including, among other things, racially disparate patterns in air pollution that compromise people's immune systems and exacerbate respiratory conditions. Environmental justice politics have also been surfacing in social unrest over the murders of George Floyd and other Black Americans, and also in resistance to colonial extractive development projects like oil and gas pipelines, including in the protests you see in this image here in the top right over the Line 3 pipeline. So there's a lot of pressure on government agencies to attend to environmental injustice and to do a better job of addressing it, including through instituting environmental justice reforms to regulatory practice and broadly to environmental regulatory practice. Environmental regulatory agencies and other agencies like the Delta Stewardship Council have the power to help address environmental injustices. And so my work and my interest is in trying to help government agencies figure out how to do exactly that. So since 2011, I've been studying government agencies' environmental justice efforts. And what I'm going to share with you today are key findings from my new book, From the Inside Out. And so the key take-home points that I'll cover in my talk today include, first, that government agencies' environmental justice reform efforts are crucial. Second, that they face a whole lot of constraints. And those constraints take somewhat familiar forms of external material factors that make it difficult for staff to do what they've been asked to do, but they also take the form of cultural forms. And that's what I'll really focus on in my talk today, is some of these elements of workplace culture in regulatory agencies that have challenged the efforts of staff to develop environmental justice reforms to regulatory practice. And the third point is that there's a lot that agencies can do better in order to support environmental justice. So we can talk at the end about what some of those next steps are. All right. So many state and federal agencies in the United States have been engaging in a lot of different efforts to address environmental injustice. For instance, and these are some of the key ones listed here on the left, agencies have established environmental justice policies. They've convened environmental justice advisory committees. These are groups of stakeholders who they bring in to advise the agency on what its environmental justice reforms should entail. They've hired or designated environmental justice staff. So these are folks who are tasked with leading the development and dissemination of environmental justice reforms and programs within their agencies. I'll talk more about them. Some agencies have developed environmental justice grant programs that allocate funding to community-based organizations and tribal organizations to support their work that informs government agency practice and also helps to just make material improvements in overburdened communities. They've developed EJ screening tools. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with CalEnviroScreen, which is the EJ screening tool developed by the state of California and arguably one of the best in the country as a geospatial technique for identifying the scope of certain environmental inequalities across the landscape and how those overlay spatially with demographic data that indicate forms of social vulnerability to the effects of exposure to those hazards. And then some agencies have developed guidance documents that direct government agency staff on how to do a better job of addressing environmental justice issues through their everyday work. So these accomplishments that I've listed here reflect many years of very hard work by agency staff and also by environmental justice activists who have been advising government agency staff all along the way through formal and informal mechanisms. And yet, agencies' environmental justice efforts still fall far short of key environmental justice movement principles. And in particular, most of the accomplishments that have been made thus far pertain to public engagement, so increasing government agencies' engagement with the public, but not to the very important policy work and other structural reforms to the ways that decisions are made about environmental hazards and environmental resources that would accomplish the other key tenets of environmental justice as it pertains to government agencies' regulatory work. So here's how I summarize how we should conceptualize what it means to apply EJ principles in the context of environmental regulation, government agency, environmental decision-making in general. Environmental justice requires the environmental regulatory agencies and other government agencies implement reforms across agency practice that will accomplish three things. First is that these reforms will enable members of overburdened and vulnerable communities to have greater control over government decision-making that affects their lives. And the work that agencies have been done to increase public engagement is a really important part of this. But largely what's been done in terms of community engagement is increasing the dissemination of information out to communities about pending regulatory decisions, which is important. And in some cases, increasing opportunities for the public to comment on regulatory decisions, also really important. What's been accomplished less toward this first tenet is actually creating mechanisms whereby members of community can influence the shape of regulatory decisions. So to actually change the ways that decisions are made in government agencies. Second, kind of the second key principle that environmental justice requires of government agencies is that agencies systematically reduce environmental hazards in the most overburdened and vulnerable communities. This has not occurred through agencies' environmental justice reform efforts yet, nor has the third tenet, which is that agencies implement reforms that would reduce environmental inequalities across communities, because equity matters. So in terms of these second tenets, let me just give you, let's see, just going to give you a quick couple of examples about what this might mean. So for instance, in the realm of rulemaking, the development of rules to put legislation into practice, environmental justice would require that government agencies conduct meaningful environmental justice analysis for every new rule or rule revision, and that they be required to do so. And then the decision makers take those analyses and public input very seriously in the decision-making process. And the government agencies revise rules so that they improve environmental conditions in overburdened and vulnerable communities and reduce environmental inequalities across communities. So the scope of the changes that environmental justice requires for environmental regulatory practice are substantial. Or let me give you another example in the realm of permitting. So environmental regulatory agencies are responsible for permitting various environmentally hazardous activities. Environmental justice would require that agencies conduct meaningful environmental justice analysis for every permit application, take those analyses and public input seriously in the decision-making process, and revise or deny permits that would exacerbate cumulative environmental impacts in overburdened communities. This is not done. It's sometimes done, but not systematically. So the kinds of changes that I'm describing, the changes that environmental justice requires of government agencies, involve most people in government agencies with any environmental regulatory responsibility, not just environmental justice staff, not just those who have been tasked with leading these efforts. There's too much pressure on environmental justice staff or tribal liaison staff to do all of this work. Legal scholars have argued that agencies have the authority to do many of these practices, and many of them can be done with existing resources and will become more efficient with time and practice. And yet agencies aren't doing most of these things systematically, and not in ways that broadly reduce environmental inequalities. So my question and my research is why? What are the challenges facing, and in particular, what are the challenges facing agency staff as they work to try to develop and implement environmental justice reforms? And I pursued answers to this question through various research methods, including collecting agency documents, which enabled me to describe what agencies have done and how agencies are conceptualizing environmental justice in relation to their other kind of their broader scope of work. But I also wanted to understand not just what agencies say they do, but also what they do and what the experiences are of staff who work within them. And so I've conducted extensive, confidential, in-depth, semi-structured interviews with government agency staff. I've also observed staff at meetings as they deliberate proposed environmental justice reforms. Some of those meetings were public meetings, and some of them were internal closed-door meetings. The research sites that I conducted my research at include US EPA headquarters in Washington, DC, as well as most of its regional offices. There's 10 regional EPA offices across the United States, as well as several other satellite EPA offices. And my research sites also include 7 state-level environmental regulatory agencies, including California EPA. And then I also had some research participants at Department of Justice, Department of Interior, and several city or county agencies across the country. So I had a lot of different sites in my research, which turned out to be, wasn't my plan initially, but it turned out to be really important for my ability to protect the confidentiality of my research participants. In some cases, there's very few folks working within any one agency on environmental justice reforms. And I wanted all my participants to feel free to speak frankly with me about their opinions about environmental justice reforms and the constraints that they face in their work. And staff were very, very frank with me. I'll share with you some of the challenges and frustrations that they expressed. I just want to say a couple of words about the interviews, because they're such an important part of my data collection. So about half of the staff who I interviewed are folks who I call EJ staff. So these are people who've been formally tasked with proposing environmental justice reforms to regulatory practice and leading the rollout of those reforms. The other half of my interviews were with folks who I, just for lack of a better term, I call other staff. And that term refers to any staff member regardless of hierarchy. So I'm using that term as a catch-all phrase. It includes management, it includes leadership. And in that group, I purposefully sampled for variation along various lines, including racial and gender identity, but also their degree of authority within their institution, and also their degree of apparent enthusiasm or support for environmental justice reforms. And of these other staff, demographically, they reflect the broader population of staff within these agencies, which is to say that most of them are white, and most of them are of a certain professional class status, having been trained in engineering, law, or the sciences. In contrast, the environmental justice staff tend on average to be persons of color, and certainly to a degree that's disproportionate relative to the broader population of staff within these agencies, which tend to be fairly white institutional spaces. And I'll come back to those demographic patterns later, and we can talk about how those matter, because they certainly do. And the other thing that I'll say here about my interviews with government agencies, EJ staff, I interviewed the majority of EJ staff during the period of my study. So I have really robust, rich insights into the experiences of what it's like to try to lead the development and rollout of environmental justice reforms in government agencies. Okay, so happy to talk more about the methods later on. So what have I learned? Learned a lot. And perhaps most importantly, I've learned that staff in government agencies work under many constraints. And I know that you all do not need me to tell you this, but it's important to recognize. So staff care deeply about their work, but they cannot do everything asked of them. And this came through very clearly in my interviews and in my observations of staff. And it's something that's also reiterated by other scholars. Staff really emphasized that they work within a context of limited and often shrinking resources, and they have so many demands on their time. And so new environmental justice reforms that are proposed come in at a time where they already feel overstretched and unable to spread their time across additional new tasks. Staff also emphasize that they work within a context of considerable constraint when it comes to regulatory authority. There are many laws. It's not always clear how staff can meet all of them. They know that they need to not put themselves at risk of being sued for overstepping their authority. And I know that this is not an abstract threat in the context of environmental politics. And they also are often working in contexts of considerable rollback of regulatory authority, especially in recent years. And so within that, with those kinds of regulatory authority constraints, there are a lot of questions that get raised about the authority that staff have to do certain tasks that environmental justice advocates would want them to do. There are also constraints around analytical tools. CalEnviroScreen is a great environmental justice screening tool, but it's also really limited in certain capacities, especially when it comes to staff members wanting to be able to make decisions that regulated authorities will be upset with. So, and we can talk more about that. Staff also emphasize that in some cases they work in contexts where leadership do not display strong support for environmental justice, and or where they work in agencies that are really siloed, where environmental justice would require collaborating across these different areas of regulatory practice, where those kinds of connections are not well established. So, and yet, despite these constraints, one thing that also became clear in my work is that staff also make decisions about how to do their jobs well. So within these highly constrained environments, staff make decisions about how to do good work. They feel committed to serving the public and protecting the environment. And this identity as public servants and environmental stewards is something that survey research has also demonstrated. You know, in this population, the broader population of environmental regulatory agency staff told me all kinds of pretty incredible stories about how they don't give up when times get tough. They told me these stories about perseverance and personal sacrifice that they've made in the context of their jobs, including under remarkable intimidation by regulated actors. But they also conveyed, just through describing to me ways in which they do their work, they conveyed to me all kinds of everyday ways, mundane ways, in which they make decisions about how to do their work in ways that feel right to them. So staff use their judgment and some discretion about how to do good work. And for some staff, this has meant implementing environmental justice reforms and really becoming champions for environmental justice in their agencies. And environmental justice staff emphasize that this is something that has increased over time, and especially in the past couple of years. But for many other staff, doing their jobs well has meant rejecting environmental justice reforms. I found in all of the agencies in my study and under all types of political administrations, considerable pushback against environmental justice reforms by staff. So when we talk about the constraints to government agencies' environmental justice reform efforts, we also have to recognize that there is often considerable internal resistance to environmental justice reforms, with some staff rejecting those reforms as conflicting with their ideas about what good environmental regulatory practice requires. So I found that this resistance takes many forms. I'm going to tell you about a few of the most common ones, and then we'll talk about my findings about where this seems to come from. I'm just looking at the Q&A really quickly. And I think with both of these, so I'll come back to these later. But thank you for the questions. We'll circle back to those. So staff engage, one of the things I do in the book is I describe a lot of different kind of ways in which staff engage in practices that undermine proposed environmental justice reform efforts within their agencies. The most common one by far, and something that's just pervasive across all of my study sites, is that many staff just ignore environmental justice reforms to regulatory practice. They might say they'll do them, and then they just don't do them. Second, staff will do environmental justice reforms, but they'll do them only superficially. This is something that's widely characterized as checking the box on EJ. People use this term and when they lament about this practice, other people use this term without any sense of misgiving about it. So as one example of checking the box on environmental justice, somebody working in an enforcement division might hold a public hearing about an upcoming enforcement action, but they may not advertise it well. Or they might hold the hearing and use it as a way to disseminate important information, but then not ask community for input at that hearing. Or they might hold the hearing, collect community input, but not actually take it seriously during the decision-making process. And this is something that my research showed is pervasive, is that government agencies many staff within them do not consider public input a meaningful source of data that they should take seriously in the decision-making process. Third, key staff with expertise on environmental justice issues are often left out of important moments of decision-making that they should be included in and consulted in. Fourth, staff will often clearly state their disagreement with environmental justice reforms, and not just their disagreement, but just kind of a blatant disparagement of environmental justice reforms. I'll give you some examples of that in a moment. And I should also note that some of the forms of staff pushback against environmental justice reforms include intimidation of and retaliation against environmental justice supportive staff within these agencies. Now, not everyone in government agencies engages in these practices. And in fact, my data don't enable me to tell you what percentage of staff engage in any of these practices. But what my data do enable me to speak about, and what I can say with confidence, is that enough staff engage in these practices to stymie and undermine environmental justice reform efforts within these institutions. At every agency in my study, including agencies whose leadership has explicitly endorsed environmental justice principles, nearly all of the environmental justice staff I interviewed described their work now and in the past as fraught. They described considerable pushback from their coworkers. They characterized their work as facing a total resistance. They described their work as a battle, as a struggle, as pulling teeth. Here's one of the quotes from one of my participants, and just to be clear, any of the names that you see here are pseudonyms, so they're fake names to protect folks' confidentiality. But this one participant just described that she said, you're pushing against a brick wall in every direction internally with staff in the agency through her environmental justice work. So the question is why? Why is there so much resistance to and pushback against environmental justice reforms in a context in which those reforms are so important for the broader public? There's a lot of reasons, and in the book I go through and give much more detail into some of the various kind of roots of this resistance against environmental justice. A lot of staff are unfamiliar with environmental justice issues. They're not trained in it. They're trained in engineering. They weren't trained in the social sciences, for instance. There are certainly issues around resources and budget cuts in certain areas and staff being overworked. There's also uncertainty about regulatory authority. A lot of this stems from the fact that legal counsel and environmental regulatory agencies tends to be comprised exclusively of folks with training in environmental law and no training at all in civil rights law or its intersection with environmental law. So there's still a lot of questions and a lack of guidance about what agency staff can lawfully do to support environmental justice within their agencies in terms of expertise from agency legal scholars or legal authorities. But I also found that much of the time staff reject environmental justice reforms because those reforms conflict with their ideas of what their organization does and should do. So the resistance for staff, the kind of motivation for staff pushback against environmental justice reforms stems from popular ideas about what it means to do good work within these agencies. And I'm going to tell you quickly about two specific primary forms of this. And they have to do with how staff interpret what it means for government agencies to be fair and effective. So let's start first with fairness. So in many cases, staff, one of the key findings in my research is that staff often reject environmental justice reforms as incompatible with what their organization does and should do by asserting that environmental justice reforms violate their idea of what it means to be fair or neutral. And fairness or neutrality is really important in government agencies, but it can be defined in different ways. And I found that some staff members' ideas of fairness compel them to do things that undermine environmental justice reforms. In particular, at all of the organizations in my study, much of the discursive resistance, this kind of pushback to EJ that I witnessed and was told about, focused on the fact that proposed environmental justice reforms explicitly identify and seek to reduce racial environmental inequalities, among other things, with staff arguing that the race-conscious nature of environmental justice reforms violates their organization's neutrality. But the way to be fair is to turn a blind eye to race, to be colorblind. And in a way, this makes sense. In the contemporary United States, as contemporary race scholars have long demonstrated, colorblindness has been the dominant way that racial fairness has been understood for quite some time. This is how many of us were taught to be fair. Many of us were taught to understand racial fairness as being colorblind. So this isn't unique to any government agency. This is part of life in the United States today. And as a result, many staff bristle at the notion of analyzing and discussing racial environmental inequalities. It feels unfair. It feels biased. And so they push back against environmental justice, race-conscious environmental justice reforms. So I'll give you an example of this. One environmental justice staff person told me that when she has proposed environmental justice reforms like increasing outreach in communities of color, colleagues and managers will respond that that constitutes reverse racism. And they'll say, why should those communities of color get this extra treatment? We need to protect that middle-class white community too. So this perspective that she's describing frames race-conscious policies like government agencies' EJ reforms as unfairly discriminating against and taking resources away from whites. The problem is this perspective dismisses the fact that racial environmental inequalities are vast and deep. So given that, environmental justice and other movements for racial justice assert that fairness requires identifying and remedying existing inequalities, racial and otherwise, not turning a blind eye to them. I found that colorblind ideas about fairness sometimes compel some staff to undermine environmental justice staff members' efforts in quite dramatic ways. So just as one example, one of my research participants, I call him Peter, he described to me how he had developed an environmental justice training. It's like a webinar, a 1-hour webinar for the staff at his agency. And after the training was unfolded and disseminated, a couple of his colleagues at the agency filed a formal civil rights complaint against him, alleging that the training that he developed violated their civil rights, in part because it addressed racial inequality explicitly. Now, the Office of Environmental Justice had to investigate this allegation. They put the training on hold while they did the investigation. As these things often do, the investigation took quite some time. It took about a year. And in that time, his management changed. And although the Office of Civil Rights ultimately found that the allegation was unfounded, that there was no violation of civil rights here, his new managers didn't want him spending his time on the training. And so the training was killed anyway, even though the allegation turned out to be unfounded. Other staff too have described to me stories about ways in which they've been threatened for their environmental justice work, not promoted, held back because of their environmental justice work, and how much some other colleagues and managers disagreed with the environmental justice reforms that they were trying to promote. But more often, staff appeal to colorblind ideas of fairness in ways that undermine environmental justice reforms with practices that are generally much more subtle than this. And I'll give you an example of this to show kind of the subtlety, but also the work that that can do. there's a manager at one state level environmental regulatory agency who I met with on multiple occasions and who I observed in meetings. And I call him Tim, and he talked with me about some various different environmental justice reforms that staff in his agency had recommended to various steps within the permit review process and other core regulatory decision-making processes. And as he told me, and as he vocally insisted in his agency's environmental justice committee meetings, which importantly, these are the environmental justice committee at his agency is where representatives across the agency voluntarily come together to develop the environmental justice reforms that would then be disseminated across the agency. So he volunteered to be on this EJ committee. But as he consistently stated in those meetings and to me as well, environmental justice reforms are unnecessary because we are doing the same thing for people regardless of who they are. This is something I heard again and again from him in different forms. And what he's saying here, he's saying a couple of things. On the one hand, he's saying we don't discriminate, and that's good. That's really important. But he's also saying we won't examine racial environmental inequalities or address them. And what he says matters a lot. As the highest ranking person in the agency's environmental justice committee, he functioned as a de facto gatekeeper for what they could accomplish. He fought against any environmental justice reforms that were not optional. He contested various environmental justice reform proposals outside of these meetings as well, thereby delegitimizing them more broadly. He ignored the recommended EJ reforms that staff were trying to promote, and he told his own staff that they don't need to implement them. So the principles of environmental justice and the various statutes and executive orders, policies, and regulations that mandate environmental justice reforms define fairness very differently. They assert that government institutions, to be fair, need to explicitly identify racial environmental inequalities and explicitly work to reduce those. This is a race-conscious conception of fairness. It would be measured very differently. And yet agencies and their staff rarely assess their progress in those ways. So really quickly, I'll just say a couple of words about effectiveness. This is another source of resistance to environmental justice reforms that I found in my work. So I also found that agencies' EJ efforts conflict with popular ideas about how we should measure the effectiveness of government agencies. It's really crucial that agencies be effective, but it can be defined in different ways. And scholars have shown that widely across the United States and for many years, environmental politics has been dominated by the belief that the responsibility of government agencies is to ensure environmental quality for as many people as possible. And so government agencies' effectiveness is measured and conveyed in terms that are aggregated across the population. This is what political theorists call a utilitarian measure of effectiveness. And this ideal is invoked throughout agency reports that consistently characterize progress in aggregated terms. Here's one example of this. This is a screenshot of US EPA's website on PM 2.5, so very fine particulate matter, a very serious public health hazard, and also a very serious environmental justice concern. But EPA's website on this, what it shows you is this highly aggregated representation of its progress on PM 2.5. So singular data point for every year, one for the entire nation. And measured in this way, EPA has been effective. But measuring effectiveness only in this way precludes us from being able to see the unevenness of these accomplishments with the inequality that persists despite them. So the principles of environmental justice and the various regulations and statutes that require it define effectiveness very differently. They assert that government agencies to be effective, that to be effective, government agencies need to decrease hazards in the most burdened communities and decrease environmental inequalities across communities. That's an egalitarian conception of effectiveness. That's how the term political theorists use. And it's something that would be measured very differently. And yet agencies and their staff rarely assess their progress in these ways. So let me say a few words to wrap up so we can have some time to have some Q&A. Environmental justice reforms differ from many popular ideas about what it means to be fair and effective or otherwise to do good work within the environmental regulatory sector. And they ask, environmental justice reforms also at the same time ask staff to do new tasks at a time when their authority and resources are being challenged. And so as a result, staff get defensive and resistant to environmental justice reforms. And yet serious inequalities by race, wealth, and indigenous status persist. So we need to redefine what it means for government agencies to be fair and effective. And we need to revise the metrics that we use to evaluate them. So the question is, how is this done? Change needs to happen at all levels of government decision-making. Environmental justice will require changes that are both top-down and bottom-up simultaneously. Integrating environmental justice into organizational practice will also require some change to the way pretty much everybody does their work. It's not something that EJ staff or tribal liaisons can accomplish on their own. There are also, I must say, there is no blueprint for doing this. You all of you who are out there, you'll have to innovate. You're going to need to tailor your approaches to your own office. You're going to try some things. You're going to fumble. That's okay. And then you'll revise your approach and it's an iterative process, an ongoing iterative process that's going to take a lot of time, but needs to start now. Just as a reminder of key tenets, these can be your guiding light for what environmental justice requires of environmental government practice. I'm going to list here a set of recommendations. This is a highly kind of summarized, shortened list. It's also ambitious at the same time. So I don't mean to imply that the items on this list, are easy. I recognize the constraints that government agencies work within, but I also recognize that staff regularly, constantly make decisions about how to do their jobs well. So the task for staff throughout government agencies is to put environmental justice at the center of how you think about, talk about, set expectations about, evaluate, and practice public service and environmental protection. So I think I'll pause here and expect that we'll have some conversation about these different recommendations. And I would also love to hear from you all other recommendations that you have that you would add to this list. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harrison. That was a wonderful talk, a lot to learn from your work across the many agencies that you've studied. I think there's a lot relevant here as a lot of the attendees on our webinar are working within our own agencies to begin building more efforts and more focus on environmental justice. So we'll jump over to the audience Q&A. We'll try to get to as many as we can with the remaining time. Please continue to add your questions to the Q&A or the chat box. And as a reminder, we just ask that everybody remain respectful and on topic for the talk today. So I'll start with, let's see, our first question was more of a comment about some of the language being used. And I think that came in early in your talk, so hopefully some of the definitions clarified as you went. I'll jump to our next question that asks, what further research do you think is needed to better understand EJ initiatives and the constraints on government agencies for doing this work?
Great question. certainly more research is needed to clarify regulatory authority. There's some great work out there, but it definitely, there's much more to be done to establish authority to do particular environmental justice reforms. And that's something that is necessarily also going to be needed to be done in the context of each state, for instance. So that's definitely one area for legal scholars where their contributions are really essential. In terms of other kinds of research needed to better understand environmental justice initiatives and constraints, there's some really important work going on right now around how to make government agency engagement with communities that are overburdened and vulnerable, how to make that engagement most effective. And I mean, there's, a lot of government agency staff most of them are not from communities with EJ concerns or facing environmental inequalities. And they don't share a lot of affinities with members of these communities. So there's a lot to be done to help agencies understand what it takes to interact most effectively, most respectfully, and most meaningfully with communities through those steps. So those are definitely a couple of areas that definitely need more work, more research.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Dr. Harrison. The next question wants you to elaborate on your collaborative efforts to amplify and connect BIPOC community voices with government agencies. So if you could talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, good question. So a lot of my earlier work was on political conflict over pesticide drift, and especially focused in the state of California, which is where I'm from. So it's nice to be back. And a lot of that work was that research was really focused on hearing from community members in communities that were really facing significant hardships from exposure to agricultural pesticides and substantial illnesses that residents attributed, at least in part, to pesticide exposures, and pretty extraordinary degrees of being dismissed by members of the medical community or scientific community or regulatory community or other, kinds of public institutions. And so an important part of my work for that project was really bringing that information from communities and integrating it with established scientific understandings of the scope of the problem in order to demonstrate that the scope of the problem of pesticide drift, the offsite movement of pesticides and pesticide exposures beyond, is much more extensive than official data would indicate. So that's just one example. I tell that example as a way of illustrating how my own knowledge about environmental justice and what that experience of being exposed to multiple hazards and being dismissed in terms of legitimacy by public officials, my training in that came from members of, especially members of farm working communities who had decided to become politically active around that issue. Now, with this particular project that I'm describing here, I took that training into the agencies and used it as my kind of baseline understanding of what environmental justice requires. So I've conducted interviews with and observations of environmental justice community members and movement organizations for the entire 20 years that I've been conducting research on environmental justice. And I use their arguments about what justice requires, and especially what it requires of government agencies, as my set of expectations about what government agencies ultimately should be doing and the benchmark to hold them to. And then I look to see, what do government agencies, what are they actually doing, and why aren't they doing as much as they could be? So that's how I'm thinking about how I connect BIPOC community voices with government agencies, is trying to translate their demands into terms that are legible by staff within agencies, often who are doing work that's incredibly specific and defined, and trying to help staff think about what would it take to change the way I do my work in order to honor the demands of environmental justice movements who have pushed for EJ policies that legislatures and executive leaders across the country have backed up with formal policy.
Okay, I think we have a couple more questions that hit on a similar type of theme here. So I'll ask one, and then potentially we'll have to combine one or two more to squeeze in what time we have left. But the one question here is, how do you recommend advocating for more time to build informal or formal relationships with environmental justice organizations, given the constraints on environmental regulatory agencies, whether that's time to do this EJ work or budgetary constraints?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, so one of the key recommendations that staff who have extensive experience with environmental justice and seeing colleagues come on board with environmental justice is that one of the things they recommend is being able to go out and visit communities with environmental justice concerns. Really, for a lot of staff, because they don't have that kind of lived experience themselves, it can make a big impression to spend time in communities, hearing from community members themselves about the various types of environmental hazards that they face and the types of experiences, very dismissive experiences that they've had with government officials. And yet most agencies don't have the funding to send staff out into the field in those ways. But there's an incredible amount of training that any of us can get. Maybe it's going to have to be in your spare time. I mean, I think part of this, committing yourself to helping to support the broader project of racial justice, part of it has to be a personal commitment and a labor of love. And that might require engaging in some learning work on your own time. So I'm going to actually drop here. Let's see if I can I put something in the chat and have folks see it?
Yes, you should be able to, as long as it says chat to everybody.
Okay.
To everyone.
So here's just some resources that I found helpful. Most of these are not specific to environmental justice per se, with the exception of my book, which I list at the top. And actually, Dina Julia Whitaker's book, As Long as Grass Grows, talks about environmental justice from an indigenous perspective. She's amazing. The book is great. The others are more about racial politics in the United States today and helping you think about the importance of engaging in that. But also, just as, for those of you who are staff of government agencies, there's been a lot of really specific recommendations that have come out at the federal level by the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So this is the committee that advises US EPA on its environmental justice work. And then and I know that different government agencies in California have their own environmental justice advisory councils. There's been a lot of work done. Let's read it and listen to what people have already been saying and already been advocating of what's required of government agencies. It doesn't require spending multiple days going out into the field. It can entail kind of looking and reading and hearing from advocates who have already had a lot to say about what changes are required of government institutions. Oh, somebody asked if one of you can repost the links. It looks like, oh, I only sent mine to the hosts and panelists. Here, I'll just redo it. Sorry, folks. Hopefully you should see that.
There we go. We can also post these on the events page for follow-up if anybody doesn't have time to copy them out of the chat. Well, we're about at time. We have remaining questions here that we'll make sure to copy down so that Dr. Harrison gets them. And if there are opportunities to follow up afterwards, we welcome folks to email the council email address that was on the seminar flyer. But I just want to say thank you again, Dr. Harrison, for your time and your talk today and your thoughtful answers to the questions here. I see you added your email into the chat, so I'm assuming that means folks can contact you directly. But yeah, thank you again for all of your thoughts and sharing your work with us. I think it's greatly informative to the work that we're doing here.
Thank you. And thanks everyone.
I'll give you a round of applause from everybody, and wish we could have you in California in person.
Great. Thanks everyone. Feel free to reach out.
Great. Thank you.